If you answer all of the people also ask questions for a keyword, do you rank well for that keyword? Do you just automatically get those rankings? How much do those questions actually correlate to the search intent and the actual searches and users behind those searches? That's the question I'm answering this week, and I'm joined by Chris Green, and we're answering, does answering people also ask questions improve your rankings?
Go and scrape all PAAs, write content for everything, stick it on one page, and you'll win the internet. I'm putting that right out there. I don't think that's what this kind of study says, and I don't think that's necessarily the findings, but Mark framed it back to me really well. It's to say, well, given how many factors there are in ranking pages, in ranking content, you don't have to be really, really clear at this causal link. If there's anything significant that can set you apart from somebody else, or when you're weighing it up, what is this factor? Well, this correlation that we're seeing is still of value. And also what really helps, it's kind of intuitive. If you look at a search term and you look at the PAAs that Google provides, kind of makes sense that a page that ranks for that term might answer more of those questions just by virtue of topically they're related. And Google's saying, well, people are asking these questions, so there's going to be some inherent value in that. So that's the kind of the nutshell and the route into this.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Search with Candour. I am Jack Chambers Ward. I am your host as always. And this week is a little bit different. I'm doing a little retrospective. We did a conversation, Chris Green and I did a conversation on Also Asked a few months ago, but I never shared it on the podcast feed because this is Search with Candour, not Search with Also Asked, obviously. I'm actually doing a little series over there on Also Asked because we've got a bunch of fantastic SEO experts coming in and writing guides, writing articles, doing research and case studies, doing all this really cool stuff with the data we get through Also Asked. And Chris is the first person. So in case you haven't checked out that conversation I had with Chris about whether PAA data actually helps you rank, here it is, essentially. I thought I'd do a little thing, and just in case you haven't checked out, alsoask.com, I've gone and checked out the video, the article, all that kind of stuff. Here is the video and my conversation with Chris in full, where we discuss his methodology, his approach to everything, the kind of full tech stack that Chris used as well. We get into a lot of details, and yeah, hopefully you enjoy this as much as I did. I think if you've listened to the podcast before, you know Chris Green has been on many times before. Chris and I are good friends. He's a fantastic guy. Really, really insightful, really knowledgeable, really interesting. And what I really appreciate was very self-critical or critical of the methodology and how that could have improved in a very, very positive and healthy way. So here is my conversation with Chris Green, talking all about whether answering PAA data and people also ask questions actually helps you improve your rankings. My guest has worked in SEO for almost 15 years. You may recognize him from speaking at Brighton SEO, Digital Olympus, Digital Marketing Day, and, of course, Search Norwich, and perhaps his 3 previous appearances on Search with Candour. He is the Technical Director at Talk Partnership. Welcome, Mr. Chris Green.
Hello, thanks for having me. Good to be back on. This is
Absolute pleasure, mate.
It's getting that comfort. Like I almost need my own slippers and mug now.
I think that is, we do have some Candour mugs. You've got the Also Asked hoodie. I feel like you're part of the family, Chris. That's how that works. Exactly. And I know I was talking to you just before we started recording, and this is kind of a little bit different. We're going to dive into some Also Asked stuff specifically. This is going to be on the Search with Candour podcast feed, but it's also going to be broken out into a lot of the Also Asked stuff. So if you're watching us for the first time, hello everybody, welcome. And this is basically going to dive into something you've been using People Also Ask data for, Chris, a study you've done recently with us. And that is all about how answering People Also Ask questions can correlate with organic rankings. And I find that question really interesting because that feels like the whole crux of that approach, right? That feels like kind of the fundamental thing of what we talk about and what Mark talks about a lot with Also Asked is how much can these PAA questions actually factor into your organic strategy. So I guess I kind of want to open the floor to you and kind of start things with why you think this is an interesting question to ask and what was your kind of initial thoughts when you were having that conversation with Mark about this study?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I mean, I've talked to Mark about a lot of this stuff and followed the PAA box and the data that it pulls out and the methodology for a while, and it's one of those things that you can kind of look at that data and what comes out of it, and you can be like, huh, well, some of that's not super surprising. Some of it might be. It's kind of useful. It's kind of not. But it feels almost taken for granted. Oh, there's just this
Hmm.
list of related questions. Now, what's what I think that why I think has become more important recently. I mean, or why it should deserve more attention recently is because of where those questions come from, how they're derived, and who's producing them, and fundamentally, like um, my fascination with it has been more along the lines of, well, how do we use this as a journey into potentially AI search world when theory query fan out, try and say that 3 times, becomes more ubiquitous, or certainly more focused upon. And I think there's that whole kind of mix of things has been super interesting for a while. And um, I've done lots of things looking at that data just to see like how can we use it and how does it scale. And some of it's intuitive, some of it less so. The actual into this specific study, it kind of I came at a tangent. I didn't one day think, I wonder if you answer more questions, you rank better. Um, that wasn't the opener. The actual opener was still preoccupied with this thing that Gary from Google said at a SEO FOMO event in London earlier that Mark was also at. And one of the things that they're saying is Google's preoccupation now, especially in the age of generative AI, is how do we distinguish value? How do we understand where
Hmm.
originality and unique thought comes from? Like, how do we differentiate a summary of the summary from something that's unique and valuable? And this isn't like a direct response to that, but this is kind of like one of the tangents that I went on off the back of that. One of which being is, how do you, without all of the resources that Google has, try and find a proxy for originality of a given piece of content? And I know there's lots of papers and frameworks around this already, like needs met, and how you can kind of interrogate that. Um, but the absolute TLDR in that whole rabbit hole was it's actually really hard to do accurately, because unless you have like the full scale of data that Google has, or you start working with Common Crawl and doing massive stuff, it's actually really challenging. But one of the approaches that I started looking at was, well, what if we just take a set of indicative questions for a given topic or area, and we judge how well any given piece of content answers those questions? So from this hypothetical sort of tangent, let's go top 100 results, 50 questions. Let's grade every single piece of content in that top 100 on how many of these questions it answers and how well it answers them, just as a point of principle. And generally speaking, like originality and added value would say, well, the one that scores the most is probably the best. I don't know. So that was where I started, and for me, PAAs and also Ask were like, well, that's where I'm getting my questions from. There's a little bit of kind of convenience there, but also I'm like, well, if I'm Google and I'm making that judgment, I'll use the questions that Google have generated and assume that their rationale for providing these is of value. Um, there are other ways, but that just felt accessible. And when you say here's an API, great, I have an API. Let's go and do some stuff. So that was where it started. I think the nature of what I then did, the study, I don't think I really answered the question I started out with there around like can we judge like originality and completeness, because there was a few other hiccups. The sample size was too small. But what I actually found is where we kind of got to, that actually when you start looking at this and this approach, well, and you start applying that lens on SERPs and saying, well, it looked like the SERPs that tended to rank better tended to also answer more questions or get closer to answering a lot of those. And then it kind of span out really. And that's when I said, hey, Mark, look, I've pulled some of this data. Here's an early kind of glimpse at it. And I said, look, can you try and pull it to shreds, please? Because I go through this stuff. I don't want to kind of go, look, this is definitely it. Like, go and scrape all PAAs, write content for everything, stick it on one page, and you'll win the internet. Like I'm putting that right out there. I don't think that's what this kind of miniature study says, and I don't think that's necessarily the findings. But Mark framed it back to me really well, is to say, well, given how many factors there are in ranking pages, in ranking content, you don't have to be really, really clear at this causal link. You just, if there's anything significant that can set you apart from somebody else, or when you're weighing it up, what is this factor? Well, this correlation that we're seeing, is still of value. And also what really helps, it's kind of intuitive. Like if you look at a search term and you look at the PAAs that Google provides, the questions that it says, well, it kind of makes sense that a page that ranks for that term might answer more of those questions just by virtue of topically they're related. And Google's saying, well, people are asking these questions, so there's going to be some inherent value in that. So that's the kind of the nutshell and the route into this. I know we'll get into the detail in a bit more, but yeah, we kind of knocked this idea about the methodology was the more challenging part. Like I'm not an engineer, like always put that as my caveat. I was joking, say I'm a Fisher priced analyst as well, in that sense. So it's kind of like, how do we go from a very valid question to a study that can sustain some kind of rigor, which I hope this one does.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, like you said, the kind of fundamental nature of is it original content? Does it answer those questions? Ties so much into what we've been talking about with LLMs and AI search and all that kind of stuff. Is that does it meet the user needs? Right? Does it feel like, in theory, Google has said, AI generated content can still provide value if it is still good and it is still answering the right things and providing value to the readers. And I think that's true in general. But when you have that kind of thing, as you mentioned, query fan out being a huge topic at the moment with how AI mode is reinterpreting the SERPs, for what a better phrase,
Mm,
I think it's a really interesting time to look at this kind of data that, as you said, the kind of data you can see that is coming from Google and is coming from humans through Google as well, which I think is the key part there.
mm,
You then can get a better understanding of what the user is looking for and what users need when they are using particular queries, right? And I think to get into the methodology a little bit, I think it's a really interesting way to kind of combine a few different elements of, obviously also asked, then the SERP API, and then Open AI's API. So bringing in ChatGPT in that process as well, and having an idea. And this is something Mark has talked about a lot: is the, like you said, how well does this article answer these questions, kind of thing, and is it literally a full word for word? Somebody has literally copied the PAA and put it in the article. Does it matter if it's paraphrased? Does it matter if it's succinct and all this kind of stuff? There are so many different ways we go about it. What was your kind of process to start that methodology? To what was the starting process for the kind of queries you were looking for,
mm.
the limits and that kind of thing? Because like you said, you could
Yeah.
end up with thousands of keywords, 100 positions per keyword, and then you're suddenly dealing with millions and millions of points of data, right?
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, that was probably one of the hardest parts of this is actually valid keyword selection because firstly, this study is circa 560 odd terms. By the time I took out like various others, we were sort of aiming for around 600. But when you're looking at that many keywords, it's quite easy to skew the data set. I mean, in an ideal world, this would be 10, 20, 40, 50K, and not saying that that isn't going to happen, but this particular one is a smaller set. So what I try to do as part of the selection is break it down into three different niches, just to make sure that we weren't seeing particular bias in a certain industry, and then separate each of those into like four key intent stages. And I've used broadly the SEMrush model, the commercial, informational, navigational, transactional. Um, Not saying that's an endorsement of that model. It's more because a lot of the keyword tools already utilize that framework. So classifying, sorting, just meant that we had some work to go. I think reframing this kind of study with the lens of potentially even the framework that OpenAI provided on like ChatGPT use, like how have they classified user and audience data, or we could even go further down the rabbit hole of like the more broader intent types that this doesn't really capture that well. But for now, a lot of this was done. Degree of accessibility, it was fairly easy to do, but also we could say, well, if there were specific trends at certain points in that customer journey or particular niches, we could identify that and just hopefully work out that if there's any quirks in selection or bias. In terms of the actual selection in those, I actually use Data for SEO's keyword tool as well to just pull it down. And I just capped each section at a certain level. So there wasn't much, if any, like manual keyword selection in that as well, because again, unless I specifically wanted to interrogate like my method of pulling keywords. It just felt fair to go, here's my seed, it's in this place. I'm looking at these intent stages, pull down and stop at a certain level. And that's pretty much what I did there. Um, Definitely, like we'll come on to like, the full where could we go do more with this. I think this would absolutely not suffer from having just more, like in terms of volume there.
Mm,
But I also, out of what I've looked at, and how we've looked at it, and kind of I ran and reran the process and had a look at things that I don't think we're necessarily picking a huge amount of bias out of the data. The story is broadly consistent across the base, so it's not. I don't think it's hinging on that. Um, so that was the keyword side, and then from like the pipeline, kind of already said. I think the also asked API felt like a really logical place to pull that data. Already subscribed, worked with it, knew that it worked. Kind of job done to a less greater or lesser extent there. And then again with SEO data, I use a couple of the different providers, but I could have used any, to be fair. I mean, the fundamental part of that was just here's the list of keywords that I've built. I need to go and pull down X number of results for that. So that's essentially what I did. Key thing about that is I only fetched the top 20. I did some really early tests with this where I went down full top 100, and generally speaking, this isn't going to be like mad news to anyone, but the further away from position page one you get, just the worse the results get for ranking in that. So conceptually, like you start to see really odd trends coming out of things when you see a page that ranks really, really low, and that there are it's hard to judge whether there's actually a lot of value in that. Also, from just the sheer amount of data and how we've got to work with it just didn't feel super valuable. And the correlation between questions asked on page 8 in Google kind of doesn't impact anybody beyond the that might be interesting, but there's nothing like that drives action from that, in my opinion. So, like the top 2 pages, realistically, are we going to go any further? We see Google's num 100 changes to how rank track is scraping. I've seen clients lose 40% of impressions overnight. It's like, well, there were people. Most humans clearly aren't going that deep into SERPs if we stop that happening and it drops off. So again, it kind of justified what I think we all knew anyway, right? So top 20 C terms, I've just pulled out the organic results. So that's another key caveat is we're not looking at all different answer boxes, like what is organic, what isn't organic. And we've obviously got different ranking mechanisms in each. And I didn't then want to start pulling in rankings of PAAs because that gets a little bit meta when I'm answering it. Just for simplicity, and because I'm an SEO, 10 blue links, as much as that's a myth now, I've pulled the top 20 of them. And that was kind of the, I guess, the easy parts of the pipeline. The trickiest bit is extracting the content, because turns out scraping the web at scale is really hard. Like we give Google a hard time as in SEO industry, and to be honest, that's kind of our job, right? But when you're suddenly given a list of tens of thousands of pages that you've got to go and scrape that content out and make sure you're pulling the right content and it's meaningful and you're not getting blocked and various other things, it's actually really kind of challenging. So I used Readable. Was it Readable? Yeah, Readability JS, which is the Firefox kind of accessibility mode. Basically, strips out everything that's not useful to people who need to just have the content read to them, and then scrapes the entire URL library of that I collected with that model, and then did some post processing and exclude. There's a lot of content in there that wasn't crawlable or passable and various other things. But that got me top 20 results and all of the content in one place. I kind of gone for a long period. That's not even the full pipeline yet, but I don't know if there's any other kind of questions or things before I carry on rattling through.
No, yeah, I think the content extraction stuff is always interesting to me because, like you said, there's often a lot of fluff. It's almost the same methodology you were talking about with the SERPs, right? Like you can pull out absolutely everything, but you end up with data you're not actually going to use and stuff that isn't actually helpful, and you kind of clog
Mhm.
up your data in many ways. I think that's a good way of kind of was that pre-filtering process, right? Of going through and making sure you're picking the right stuff. And then I guess with those keywords, you're kind of going through, pulling through the also asked data. How deep did you go on the also asked stuff? Was it the sort of like initial search? Was there any deep search stuff on the also ask side of things? How many of those questions roughly do you know if you're
I'm
pulling per
pretty
query?
sure I only went 20 deep on those, for a similar reason. And I know Mark's had
Because
this
then you're getting
methodology.
further away from the
Yeah,
key there, right? Yeah, yeah.
because I know the process that Mark's got in Screaming Frog with the PAA API that scrapes on a awesome process, incidentally. Like, just we're going to go and see, do all of our pages answer these questions as per what's in our H1 is a just a very kind of elegant way of answering those kind of questions. But part of that process, there's this almost self-selection of, well, is this question even relevant anymore? And I found from the
Mm,
test is, if the more you go past the top 20, it just goes off at a bit of a tangent. And there's just, obviously, as part of my process, not necessarily obvious to everyone yet, but I was using a version of ChatGPT to um, say, well, is this question relevant, or is this question answered or not? But it's more just a case of volume. So you go too much over 20, you go too deep, too far down a rabbit hole or down the wrong tangent, and it just gets slightly less useful then. Could have almost certainly been done, just slightly less worth doing.
yeah, definitely. And looking at those results, was there any particular hiccups or errors you bumped into there? You mentioned some crawlability issues, right? I assume
Oh
there'd
wow,
be
yeah, yeah.
JavaScript issues or I don't know, accessible content issues and stuff like that. Was there anything you bumped into that kind of threw a spanner in the works?
There's tons, if I'm honest. Some of the key ones, right? A lot of it is just general, like, bot protection. To be frank, like, I'm not a bad actor, but I'm also, for a lot of sort of bot mitigation stuff, they just don't want. Like, I don't present any value to these websites. Why would they give me their content? That's generally the premise. And I went to some lengths of looking like a realish human, but not as far as I could have done. There's we can go down some really advanced sort of like bot mitigation or counter bot mitigation stuff. Um, and for most of the sites that really didn't want me to access it wasn't a significant problem that they couldn't be accessed. A lot of them were things like YouTube. Um, Others, Reddit sometimes was quite a challenge, but I had
Mm,
to build a separate pipeline for Reddit. Uh, which actually in the data wasn't worth the effort, incidentally, but at least we stand by the rigor. Um, I think one of the niches overlapped with music, so huge amounts of Spotify playlists and stuff in there, which from
interesting.
a readable content point of view just doesn't matter. Like, someone's comedy playlist name might be all it needs to rank in some instances, or like a top list, or so. There were a number of things like that. The bot mitigation was the main one. The readability JS, I was running on locally on like a node server, so I was rendering JavaScript content, so that circumvented most of things. And then if I noticed that there are any domains or keywords where there was a significant number of results missing, I went back, repassed them, and just saw, okay, what do I need to do? I think it ended up rerunning the entire end-to-end process a few times, which again, it's the kind of, like, you think, why don't more people do this kind of study? It's like, just because it's frustrating, it takes a lot of time, and it's a set of completely different skills to an SEO's day job, like scraping, running these pipelines accurately, analyzing it correctly, etc. So um, we got to a point. I think the first pass I was probably missing, I don't know, 25-30% of the data. But for some SERPs, that was actually quite a large percentage of what I was validating. And very often it tended to be that the ones higher up I was missing more of. And it's kind of like, well, if the top half of my SERP is missing more results than not, then the conclusions you can draw get a bit weaker. So I reran a lot, and then for those where I couldn't just do a lot, I just remove those from the analysis, just to stop that kind of impacting. Um, but I would say, if you want to learn more about, like, interneting and SEO and technical side of things, and also start seeing the kind of challenges that face, I would always just do stuff like this. Like, if you are going to scrape or do this kind of work, obviously, you've got to be cognizant of, well, what is legitimate or moral or legal, and work out how you do it. But for finding very specific pieces of content, pulling it down and analyzing it does teach you an awful lot. And then you think, well, if it's blocking me, is it blocking Google? Is it blocking OpenAI? Is it?
Mm.
And then you can kind of segue nicely into bot management and other stuff like that, which is a hugely underrated but increasingly important skill set. So I would say even doing this work is really good for just general like education and skills, as by way of a tangent.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't even sort of, like you said, it's a skill that I think a lot of us know about and aware of, and you hear people doing interesting things. I know we hear Noah Lerner talk a lot about building data pipelines, and people like Dave Smart and Jamie Indigo talking a lot about all the cool bot crawling information and all that kind of stuff. But it's often not something, like you said, you kind of get your hands dirty with unless you end up doing something like this. And exactly as you're saying there, Chris, as anyone who's ever done this sort of stuff, gets incredibly frustrating with all the weird little hiccups of like, well, why did it do that? That was working 5 minutes ago. How come it's not now? Rerunning it from scratch, rerunning the script. Oh my God, all that kind of stuff can be
Mhm.
incredibly frustrating. But
It is it.
I think at the end of the day, you got some really interesting results. I think there was some overall kind of, from my perspective, I think kind of what I expected vaguely. Would you feel the same kind of way? Was the overall kind of results? I guess we're going to get into them now, right? Of like, how satisfied were you before we get into the details, and was it kind of what you expected going into it when you were doing that initial kind of poking around before we got involved and partnered up with Also Asked?
Um, Generally, yes. There were a few things that did impact it. I think um, the the very first one. So I gave GPT 3.5 Turbo the task of saying, does it answer or doesn't it answer the question? Because effectively it was the cheapest, reliable way of doing it. I started with 4.0, and that was ridiculously expensive, incidentally, and was overkill. So went with 3.5, and initially just says, does it answer it, yes or no? And that was okay. But then you realize, well, something can almost answer a question, but not explicitly so. And I found that just cut things off too much. Like I had to introduce like a partial answering to, because
Hmm.
otherwise it would just basically be like on average pages fully answered questions, like one or two questions a set. And then when I started digging into it, it's like, well, no, that has answered it. Or sometimes who'd think the searchers are asking rubbish things, and it's kind of like, well, you're asking for something that doesn't exist, but the answer might still, you can have it answered with something that's still useful, even if it doesn't explicitly answer the question. And I found adding that partial element in there helped give a bit more of a nuanced view. I would say things that surprised me, I think firstly, just in general, the number of across all niches, the number of questions that were answered fully or partially was still relatively low. Um, I don't know how significant that is, because again, it really depends. Like I would also say somebody on a kind of informational, top of their funnel sort of journey, you would probably expect more and more pages to answer the questions, and you'd expect that at like a transactional stage, maybe there's slightly fewer. And there were some kinds of correlations like that, but they weren't super strong. Like I'd say in general, you don't have to answer 10, 15 PAA questions to rank well. I would say it doesn't have to be many, because I think the bar is quite low. Um, so that was the first thing that it really surprised me. The second one is, um, when you're sort of rolling up and looking at it from a real sort of high point, there's a lot of noise in the data. So I think looking at the correlations with at the actual Pearson correlations was really when I started to see the the more close trends, and that's when you start looking at certain sections, particularly top five, the real strength of that correlation come out. And I feel, I don't know, this is kind of conjecture, but um, when you're talking about the top five results for any keyword, assuming if there's any kind of volume for it, you would say that broadly those top five pages are doing a good job to compete with one another for it. Otherwise, you'd assume they wouldn't be there. Um, I know we've all seen exceptions to that rule, but let's work to the assumption that the system works, and then we can talk about the rest at the pub. So if we say, okay, ones in the top five are good, maybe one of the differentiating factors, and I say one of because it's key, is when we get down to, well, the amount of questions. Um, because actually when you then look at the top 10 or even in the top 20, that relationship is less strong. Like I'd say even when you look at the top 20, in some intent stages like navigational and transactional, there isn't really that correlation factor almost disappears or starts inverting. So for the top half of page one, when you've done a great job and you're looking for a differentiator, answering more of these questions could be it. When you're on, bottom half of page two or mid page two, there's probably other things that you need to be working on before. So you could kind of go down. I'm an SEO. I know how to do an SEO. I'll put up a website. I'll scrape all the PAAs. I'll write the content. I'll put it all in there. You're not going to win in a competitive space just by doing that alone. Like I think that's like a really strong point in there. If you've done all of the other things right too, then that becomes one of, I hate the phrase winning move, but it becomes like what I'd say could be a winning move, right? So that, and I think that's where it kind of really crystallized for me, and you kind of sit back and think, well, yeah, that it makes sense. There'll be people watching this thinking, well, yeah, of course we'd expect that, right? I hope so. But this, I think, makes it clearer for me, certainly anyway, that this process certainly shows that relationship, and this is where we come full circle to my original, like, how do we look at quality? How do we justify whether something's unique or adds value? And I still come back to that premise of, well, if people are searching to answer a question, explicit or inferred, then answering that explicit or inferred question is only but a good thing. So a lot of the key points when you then turn this into actionable strategy is what questions, how do I answer it, how much do I need to do? And I think this adds a bit more of a steer on that, or certainly some guide rails that you can kind of test and build on.
Yeah, I think the correlations I think are pretty clear, like you said, in that top 5 section, and even within the top 10 as well. But they drop
Mm.
off pretty significantly when it comes to the top 20. And by far the most surprising thing for me reading through your study was definitely that the informational queries don't stand out significantly. I
Mhm.
would have assumed, because
Yep.
by default people are asking questions, that's an informational thing, and to as we've been doing, obviously oversimplify SEO and make it like, yeah, it's simply just these specific intents and that's how every query is divided. Obviously that's not how it works, but in general I would assume that informational queries would have by far the strongest correlation compared to things like navigational and transactional and commercial. That would make sense in my brain, right? I'm also
Yep.
aware that obviously, I have talked many times to e-commerce clients of including PAA data or FAQs and product information on product pages and product listing pages as well. There's plenty of value in
Yep.
answering questions from a transactional point of view, so I can kind of get that point as well. Was that kind of a surprise to you as well? And you,
Mhm.
you mentioned it there briefly, like the fact that the informational query didn't stand out as clearly the most significant search intent affected by this, I guess.
Yeah. I think I'll prefix it all with obviously a small sample. There's me saying at the start, I'm happy that I picked niches and I split it up, but there's a degree that could be at play, just to sort of put it out there. Um, I also think when when you're asking questions or you're at that stage in a journey, I think there's a few there could be lots more questions to answer, and I guess there's also an inherent this works on the assumption that the PAA questions are always going to relate to the web pages that Google surfaces for the query that triggered those. And I think what we've also seen, what we could be seeing, is that when you're at that stage, when there are more questions, there's more likelihood that some of those questions may differ or they may get updated at different times. Or so I think there's enough there for me to. I don't think it's counterintuitive what I first expected, but I don't think it's like super um worrying. I think where I'd step back and say, well, how do I then make this useful? I'd say it comes back to that intent, of actually what is someone trying to do in that. Because your example of FAQs on PDPs or PLPs or wherever you add them, like ecom framing, is there's so many questions, but you can pick some really bad ones, and there is a degree sometimes of that could potentially be happening. So that they're kind of it. The other one. The other big potential issue is this classification system itself, right? Like, I would say, looking at a SERP and saying this SERP is a commercial SERP, this is a transactional. I think that's never in some respects it's been easier, but in some respects I think it's never been harder, because I think Google does a bit of a better job at hedging. It's kind of saying, well, actually, based on this query and what we know about you, I'm not 100% sure what it is you need. So here's some blue links, here's a PAA box, here's a carousel, here's some other rubbish. And it's kind of reminds me sometimes of spray and pray, particularly like around the sort of higher volume searches. So it's kind of um, part of it could just be that a lot of these keywords that I've selected that were informational might also be commercial or transactional, because we do see more overlap. And as you just said there, someone's at that point, I want to buy something, but I still have a question that I need to answer on this section of my journey. So I think that anomaly could equally call out that intent model is not super robust. I hope we all were in an acknowledgement or agreement of that anyway. But sometimes when you're given something that classifies things easily, it's easy to get carried away. So um, that's a really, really long way of saying, yeah, it was a little surprising, but might not be.
From the other side of things, I think the kind of the key takeaways, I think that top 5 is clearly the most interesting thing for
Mhm.
that positive correlation. And like you said, I'm not surprised either that it drops off so significantly the further you go down. Cutting off at the top 20 totally made sense from the initial perspective. And also, like, I feel that results reinforced the decision for that as
Mhm.
well. Do you think there is, I guess, ways of understanding, like you said, those partial questions, fully answered questions? How much did that matter in terms of the completeness of the answer? Was there much
Mm.
kind of comparisons of this page completely answered this many questions compared to a partial answer of, this page compared to that in a similar kind of SERP? Or was it less of that kind of correlation between those two sides of it?
I I think when you just looked at those that completely answered, it the number dropped off quite significantly to the point where I would say there's just far fewer to even really answer it. And again, I this sort of overlaps in another potential improvement, I guess, in the process is this: we're all waiting for 3.5 turbo to say whether it's a full or a partial. Um, just the nature of the model. Like sometimes it might say full, sometimes it might say partial, because fun, like LLMs, yeah. Um, so
There's always a chance for hallucination in there, right?
well, it's just hallucination or just the judgment being. I mean, even the
Mm.
word judgment is wrong, right? Like just that interpretation, that token selection just might have fallen on a different side of it. And when you force a fairly fixed kind of output onto what isn't how LLMs generate their outputs isn't fixed. I think there's that needs to be kind of considered as well. So I think that's why I'm happy to bucket together full and partials without too much worry. Because I think I applied scores to each, so a fully answered question does score better than a partially. So I think there is still a chance that has impacted it. But if I was to split them out and try and say, do we see anything differently? Um, Without a much bigger study or a much more, we could run it on a better model, and you'd probably get better results. But I would still say there was no human in the loop on that reviewing process. I mean, there was. I kind of sampled a few, but when you kind of multiply it over the amount of times it's had to judge it, like 20 questions, 20 results over 560 keywords, I'd still be checking them. um, I think probably. So there's a degree of, I think that would be useful. I think there's from a study point of view, that's a clear gap. Like, it's not a question is just not answered yes or no. It's how well is it answered. And even today, it's like, is it answered kind of cogently in a very logical and easily extractable way that stands up by itself when removed from the context? There's a whole other direction you can go, and you really interrogate that. Um, I would still say that the North Star for us, if we're answering the question, is, do you answer the question? Is it actually useful to that person? If the answer to both those points is yes, then you're adding value, like irrespective of whether you're going to rerun the correlation study or there's, I think, and again, that it's a bit of an ideological standpoint, but adding value has to be part of the equation when we're doing this act. Otherwise, whatever we're doing may be short-lived or backfire. So, um, yeah, it's hopefully 3.5 didn't let me down.
Fingers crossed. Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, I guess if you're having conversations with clients, with fellow SEOs going forward, what is the actionable kind of thing you would recommend coming out of
Mm.
this? Do you think it is you should be thinking about adding these PAAs to your pages and answering them in depth, or answer as many questions as you can? Obviously, with the big caveat of having a technically sound site,
Yeah.
external signals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would you think would be that kind of key actionable point you would recommend if you're having that kind of conversation with a client and they ask, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
we want to implement this."
So let's go on the low budget, low time end of the equation. I would say if you want to enrich your content, the PAAs is a really good place to see what you could be utilizing. And I would, assuming you're not trying to pump out hundreds or thousands of pages of content in a short period of time, who needs that volume of content really? But there are people that do, and don't come at me. But like for most people, if you're at the low budget, low time end, focus on those PAA modules, who's ranked in them, and then also the rest of that top 5, top 10 of those queries that you want to rank for. I mean, obviously, the model of just focusing on a query is kind of moot or null anyway. It's kind of, I think kind of more moments use cases like in a journey, but that view is still the quickest way of understanding, well, what questions might we need to be answering. I think you can still overlay your own knowledge and experience on that, but if you've got a business that doesn't have the time or the budget and it's passing it out to a consultant, freelancer, small agency, what have you, that is just a great source of information. And if you QA it manually yourself first, and then you action the stuff that's right, and you really focus on how do I genuinely make a good answer, not just asking GPT-5 for what the best answer is, I think you'll do well. I'd say this study gives me enough confidence to say, well, I think when it's a coin flip between you and the other person vying for page one, and you've answered more questions better, you'll probably win based on that. Um, Not super surprising, kind of intuitive, but I feel confident in that. I'd say if you've got more time and you've got a larger budget, I think running this kind of thing, this kind of investigation in your niche for your keywords with your
Mm.
own like customer types, personas, however you want to frame it in mind, I think that would be super valuable because there are certain types of knowledge and there's a certain type of information economy around each different kind of industry or niche. And um, sometimes you can answer a lot of questions with a really, really good piece of content. You don't have to do tons. I've found in certain places, like if you can demonstrate your ability to do something really, really well, one piece of content will cover a huge amount. So you don't have to go hyper niche if you understand it really, really well. Um, so I'd say, like, where are your competitors answering questions? How are they doing it well? What techniques are they employing? Because the other thing that we also get challenged on a little bit is that I don't just want to answer questions for machines. It has to coincide with brand guidelines and it has to fit in the template. And so I think using the context of your competition and what everyone else is doing is also super valuable because if we just take an acceptance that if you're in the top 5, answering more questions is gives you more an advantage, it's great. But that I haven't said how many questions in that. Like that might be very niche dependent. In certain niches at certain stages in your buying journey, that might only be one or two, and it might be a really simple one. Be amazing. The more I'm seeing more and more and more around the almost aftercare post purchase part of a journey, there's just questions on like returns, customer satisfaction, rebuying, stuff like
Yep.
that I think people have assumed they don't need to document because it's just not that we're not tracking those bits. LLMs are kind of blowing the door off that because one of the most commonly hallucinated pages I've ever seen are like contact information or stuff like that, or press or other things. So um, you know, look at this for your entire customer journey. Look at the questions at each stage. If you're a big enough brand as well, that PAA data will basically tell you the questions you're not answering. So even outside of the study, I think there's some value there. So yeah, I guess they're your two ends. I think if you don't have a lot of budget, take it like query by query. Um, Take the assumption that that PAA module is a source of good information for you and answer all of the questions that you think you're well placed to answer and are relevant. I wouldn't say arbitrarily answer the stuff that's random because that doesn't help. And then, yeah, if you've got more resource, I'd try and run a version of this against your kind of key competitors and learn how they do it, the patterns of the answers, the kinds of content that can do it the most efficiently, because all of your barriers are very different when you get to that size. You have compliance and hurdles and other senior leadership you've got to buy in, so you've got to be looking at the efficiency standpoint as well. I guess the only other thing is just step out of the PAA bubble. You might find the longer you work at this, or if you're in a particularly competitive niche, the PAAs are kind of like your gateway, and they aren't the end of the journey. They're potentially only the
Mm.
start. I've been looking at lots of different ways of mining questions. If you have reviews, if at product level or retailer or business level, implicit in your reviews are questions. They're either answered questions or they're unanswered questions, depending on the sentiment, which is valuable. So inferring questions out of that kind of UGC is really super valuable. The other one is I think it's the Vertex AI documentation. You can even start to look at that grounding functionality in there as well, which helps you understand potentially query fan out around certain kind of prompts and queries. So that's another source of data. I wouldn't say it's the source of query fan out for AI mode or AI overviews. I would say it's a lab version of a similar mechanism. But that's another great source. I would say that okay, I've got my flow now. If there's anything you go and do, is become obsessed with the questions that could be answered around what it is you're doing. If it's asked and you can answer it, you've got to now. The amount of content that you need to just be reliably along your user journey is probably a lot higher than it was if you're really, really serious about being everywhere you can be. So that could be your new obsession. I'm still trying to tame that and make it an efficient waste of time, or an efficient obsession. Sorry, not waste of time. Stop it becoming a waste of time. But there's plenty of other directions. I mean, stuff that Mark puts out, Dan Petrovic, there's Andrea Volpini, there's loads of people who are doing a lot of really cool stuff in this area and being very, very generous with what they're sharing. So go follow them and build some stuff, and come and talk to me about what you think I've done wrong or what you'd like to do better. Be nice though, because it did take me a long time.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear we'll have more follow-up episodes talking about how also Ask can tie into plenty of other stuff, from copywriting to brand positioning to behavioral modeling and a few other bits and pieces as well. So yeah, you folks, you can stay tuned for that. In the meantime, Chris, how can people follow you, keep up with what you're doing in SEO, new studies, interesting things like that, talks
Yeah.
and all that?
So LinkedIn's probably the best place. Chris Green SEO on there. Blue Sky at Chris Green SEO. I think I have an X handle that I don't use. If you are still on there, I might not respond. Sorry. Chris-green.net, and then also Talk Partnership for anything big. Yeah, best ways to follow me. Just reach out, drop me a message. Be great to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris. Been a pleasure. I look forward to reading more of your studies, talking with you more, and yeah, hopefully catching up at a conference soon.
Awesome. Until next time.
And that wraps up this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Chris. I know it's a little bit different. I won't be doing this every single week. Don't worry. We will have some amazing guests coming up. In fact, I will give a little tease. Next week, it's somebody I've been wanting to get on the show for a very, very long time. Laura Yanku, who I have known for a little while now, one of the funniest, most brilliant people in SEO, finally joining me on the podcast. And we're going to talk all about modern UX and SEO discussions. I know we've covered that a couple of times on the show over the years, but Laura and I are going to be talking about how much that has changed, obviously with things like agentic commerce and AI search and all that kind of thing. And how do you have those conversations with design teams, with developers, with people not in SEO about why SEO is important to their process as well, and what we can learn from them as well. It's a two-way street where we're all working together here. Laura brings some really, really interesting insights, some really brilliant experience and real-world examples, and you can enjoy that on next week's episode. In the meantime, thank you so much once again for watching or listening, wherever you're watching or listening, and I will see you next week. Have a lovely week.